Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. I have about 10 more minutes to go, so I'll be done at quarter after. I'm sure Patrick will be after me. Mr. McGowan, I mean. Philip Ides of Prairie and the BCFSC again. Ms. Farlinger, thanks for your answering the questions after lunch, and I'm sorry to keep asking you, but you're the person most familiar with what goes on in BC, so are you familiar with the beach seine projects going on the Fraser River right now?
Yes, I am.
And the idea of those projects is to be selective and release non-target coho, sockeye, and chinook?
That's right.
But they're targeted primarily at pink salmon, is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah. And the idea is to count every fish, and that's correct? Count every fish?
Yeah, the idea is to harvest the available harvest without having an impact on the other stocks that are co-migrating, yes.
And in recent days, you've seen some controversy in the Globe and Mail and Times Colonist about this?
I've certainly been aware of some controversy in the Globe and Mail.
Yeah. If I could have tab 18 up, please, Mr. Lund. And if we can go to the next page in that tab.
18?
Yeah, there should be 3 photographs in that tab.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I have the files separately.
Yeah.
You just want to go to each photograph?
Yeah, I understand that.
So the first photograph?
Please.
Mr. Commissioner, I'll allow Mr. Eidsvik to ask his question just in terms of the position the witnesses may be in. These were additions to Mr. Eidsvik's list. The photographs, at least 3 of them which are attached, were added to his list last Thursday after the witnesses had commenced giving their evidence, but while they were still in chief. The first page was added to the list on Monday and would have been circulated after they were in cross-examination. Commission counsel has not provided a copy of that exhibit to these witnesses. They haven't seen it before, and I don't believe counsel for the Department of Justice has provided this exhibit to the witnesses either. We have not placed it before them in any way prior to this.
As a rule of thumb, if we had these things before about Sunday morning, the witnesses would have them. If we got them after that, they wouldn't, and I think you just said we got them after that, after Sunday morning.
I think
the Commission received this first page after Sunday morning. The photographs were received before that.
Yes,
well, the witnesses can answer then. Depending when they were given to us affects whether they got them.
Yeah. The photographs were distributed last week, Mr. Commissioner, but I wanted to ensure that I had proper identification for them, so I followed that up with an email identifying the photographs on Monday. So that's why there's a bit of confusion on the time. If we could go back to the photograph, Mr. Lund, and if you could focus in on the area where the fishing activity is taking place. Now, in that photograph, Ms. Farlinger, would you say this is representative of the selective fishing practices that you've talked about in this commission and we've heard about?
I'm not familiar with this particular photograph, but I understand it to be a photograph that was taken on the Fraser River around and about the time.
I'm sorry to rise and interrupt the witness. There may well be some controversy amongst the participants about what this photograph shows, where it's located, when it was taken. I'm going to suggest that the witness speak about what she knows, not what she understands from reading a newspaper article. I think that would be the appropriate way in which she ought to respond to the questions.
I think that's fine. And I'm specifically asking you to address, is that activity, fishing activity, you see there representative of selective fishing that you've described to the Commission and we've heard about in the past 10 months or so?
I can't say as to whether this photograph is. We certainly have selective fishing for pink salmon going on now.
Well, do you see the dead fish floating in the water? What appear to be dead fish?
I do see the dead fish floating in the water.
Do you see the dead fish on the beach, or near the beach?
I see that in some of these photographs, yes.
Could you go to the next photograph, Mr. Lund, please? That pile of dead fish on the beach, does that look like a selective fishery to you, Ms. Farlinger?
Mr. Commissioner, I object to this line of questioning. Mr. McGowan is indeed right. There's a great deal of controversy about what these photos show. They were taken, we're told, in that email which came in to the Commission on Monday morning, by someone named Chris Hodge. He's not a witness. He can't speak to what these photos show, nor can he actually, if he were here, speak to what are in the photos. The photos do not speak for themselves. My clients did some asking around in respect of the photos. They have a very different interpretation of what Mr. Eidsvik would have, would put forward. I won't get into that because they're not here to give evidence, and nor can these witnesses give evidence on that point. But I assure you, Mr. Commissioner, that there's a great deal of controversy over this. There's various interpretations of it. Perhaps the key point, Mr. Commissioner, is that the fish in that photo are not sockeye. They are pink salmon.
Excuse me, Mr. Commissioner, I'm not, now he's testifying to the content of the photo, and he just told me that he couldn't tell what was in the photo.
Yeah, that's exactly so, Mr. Commissioner. We can't tell what is in this photo. Mr. Eidsvik cannot tell you that they are sockeye. They are not sockeye. But he certainly cannot show that.
With respect, Mr. Commissioner, I question the utility of this and whether it's relevant or of any use to you whatsoever. We don't have the photographer here. We don't know when the photo was taken, where it was taken, what it was taken of. There appears to be a great degree of controversy about what the photograph depicts. From what I've ascertained from the questions and the answers so far, I can't imagine that any of these witnesses are in a position to enlighten you in that regard. The line of questioning that is likely to follow, I anticipate, and we've heard some hints of it, is going to allege something which might be arguably wrongdoing on the part of some of the participants or members of the participants. They're not here to respond to it in my submission. He can ask the witnesses questions that they can answer from their own personal experience or their own understanding, but I'm not sure these photographs assist in any regard.
Ms. Farringer, oh, sorry, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. McGowan and Council, let Mr. Eidsvik ask his question. If the witnesses have personal knowledge about the content of these photographs, they can tell him so. If they don't, they can say so. So please proceed, Mr. Eidsvik.
Ms. Farringer, do you have personal knowledge about the events depicted in this photograph, in this series of photographs?
I'm not sure about the photographs. I do have knowledge of the pink beach seine fishery being carried on currently in the Fraser River.
So, if this was a pink seine fishery in the Fraser River and you hadn't been advised of this, would you be concerned?
Advised of the photograph?
Advised of the type of fishing activity you see depicted in the photograph. Would you expect it to be advised of this as the Regional Director General?
Unless there were a problem with fish mortalities that had been caused by the fishery or other fish mortalities, I would not expect to be advised.
Well, I think if you look beside the boat, you can see a bunch of dead fish lying on the bottom of the river, a bunch of dead fish on the beach. Aren't those fish mortalities?
I have, it probably won't surprise you, been advised of the activities that are going on around the beach seine fishery. My understanding is that our staff have been on the grounds, and the concern we hear both from, or the concerns that have been expressed do not seem to me to be consistent with what I'm hearing back from my staff and with the Pacific Salmon Commission, which is that the pink salmon are piled there in preparation for being taken away after having been caught, and that most of the mortalities in the river, in fact, are fairly routine in terms of years where we have sockeye mortality in the river, and that these are all being sampled and counted. So, so far, any information that's been provided to me has been that these are well within normal mortalities in the river, and that any pink salmon on the bank are those being taken away after having been caught.
So you're telling me that this is a perfectly routine and normal type of way to fish in the selective fishery upriver?
My understanding of how the pink fishery is being prosecuted on the banks of the Fraser is that fish being caught are being piled on the banks of the Fraser before they're being taken away, and that the mortalities floating in the Fraser River are within the normal sockeye mortality expected, and is being sampled as we do whenever there is mortality in the river.
When you were familiar with the selective fishery, the seine fishery on sockeye, for example, in the Skeena River, you were aware that commercial seine boats were being fined $500 for catching a single coho salmon, and you had DFO fishery officers and counters at the unloading stations. Is this compared to that?
It does compare to that in the sense that the fishery is managed in the way to avoid catch of the non-target species, and there are landing stations and fish counted, and there are so it's not inconsistent. I think you count fish in a different way on a seine boat than you do on a beach seine, but the same principles apply.
And who counts these fish?
I can't tell you specifically who counts these fish, but I know when there is an economic fishery, there are specifics about landings, who counts them, where they're counted, and that's part of the management regime of the fishery.
Is it the Fraser Valley Aboriginal Fisheries Society that counts the fish?
I don't know the answer to that question specifically.
Are you familiar with the Fraser River Aboriginal Fisheries Society?
Yes, I am.
And who are the directors of that? Because they do catch monitoring for the Stolo fishery, is that correct?
I can't specifically name the directors today.
You're confident that none of the directors of that organization are involved in fishing?
I can't speak directly to that today. I don't know.
Thank you. I want to go back quickly, and I'm cognizant, Mr. McGowan, of the time. And I want to finish something I brought up before lunch with you, Ms. Richards. And it was the dropout rate in the set nets. How is it that the commission, that the DFO hasn't done any work on this issue?
Well, I think that there was some work that was done, just not, and there was one or two studies that were done.
Can you?
I'm just not familiar that those were some years ago, and I'm sorry, but I just can't recollect the details at this time.
Now, if the commercial public seine fleet was killing 5 fish and losing 5 fish for every one they delivered, wouldn't they have been shut down immediately?
That's a management decision, and that's not, you'd have to ask one of the management staff that question.
And one question more for you, Ms. Farlinger. We've heard a lot of talk about share-based management. Can you tell me how when DFO will impose individual quotas on the set net fishermen in the Fraser Canyon? How far are you in your discussions on that?
The arrangements for share-based fisheries have not been discussed in terms of when a decision will be made for the salmon fishery. So I don't have a date for a potential share-based fishery. I would say the feasibility of the share-based fishery has not been concluded on at this point either.
Mr. Commissioner, I could easily use another day with these particular witnesses, but I appreciate all the time and I appreciate the answers to the questions. Thank you. Get the photos marked as an exhibit, please.
For identification purposes, thank you.
Marked as MMM, triple M.
And sorry, Mr. Commissioner, I have one last issue. And it was raised by my friend about the opening and the license times that were entered as exhibits. And I think the DFO staff had a hard time, Ms. Farlinger had a hard time deciding what it is. And the problem is in the DFO webpage, it says communal openings, and then when you go to the link with the list, it doesn't show on the page. So I'm wondering if it was possible for Ms. Farlinger to check that tonight, and then very quickly we'll deal with it in the morning just for identification. It'll take 1 minute. Thank you.
Members of the panel, I'm Chris Harvey, act for the West Coast Area G Trollers and the United Fishermen Allied Workers Union. I have 40 minutes, Mr. Commissioner. I'd like to start, much as Mr. Rosenblum did, by acknowledging the heavy burden of responsibility that all the members of the panel bear in carrying out a public mandate that has huge impacts for both fish and the lives of countless individuals and communities. Those people and all Canadians owe you a debt of gratitude, I think I can say, for undertaking a difficult job. And my questions will likely indicate that I don't agree with the way you carry out your mandate, but I don't want you to think that I don't appreciate and respect the job you do. So I'd like to start with Ms. Farlinger to say to ask this: do you accept that many remote coastal communities in BC, some Aboriginal, some predominantly non-Aboriginal, have had a connection with and dependence on the salmon fishery for over 100 years?
Many of the participants in the various fisheries on this coast have been from coastal communities. Some still are, many are not. And certainly there have been secondary industries in coastal communities that have been a significant part of coastal communities.
I'm going to start by asking Mr. Lund to bring up, I think it's tab 4 on my list, is a copy of the Housat Supreme Court of Canada case, or Supreme Court of BC case. I want to just read a passage from page 686 and then ask you a question about it. Paragraph 686, Mr. Lund. This is the judgment of Madam Justice Garson in the trial court. She says at paragraph 686, I find that the evidence of the actual participants in the industry, that is the New Channel's community members, paints a more accurate picture of the New Channel's participation than the statistical evidence of experts based on licenses and quota. I also find that the loss of a fishing job in the New Channel's communities imposes greater hardship on the plaintiffs than it does on non-Aboriginal communities because of the isolation of New Channel communities and the lack of other significant economic opportunities. Evidence of other economic opportunities, such as guiding recreational fishers, working in fishing lodges, working in aquaculture, which is relevant to this conclusion and therefore admissible, and tourism, does not refute the evidence of historic economic dependence on the fishery and the relative absence of other significant economic opportunities. Ms. Farlinger, do you basically agree with those findings of the court?
I'm certainly not going to argue with the findings of the court. I do think that certainly in BC, the fishing industry, the forest industry have been significant economic opportunities to isolated communities.
Yes. All right. And while we're on this case, Mr. Lund, could I ask you to bring up paragraph 656? I'm just going to refer to the first sentence. It says, Dr. Hall testified that the individual transferable quota system is simply too expensive for New Channel fishers. Now that wouldn't surprise you, Ms. Farlinger, would it?
It wouldn't surprise me that Dr. Hall said that, no.
But it wouldn't surprise you either, would it, that, well, let's put it this way, that the ITQ system adds a layer of cost to the expenses of any fisherman. Any fisherman, I'm sorry, other than the first generation who receive it free.
Depending on the design and implementation of the quota system, there certainly is increased monitoring requirement in a quota system, and that cost can accrue to fishermen. I think there's a broad set of design principles, which means that the generality here can be tested in the design of the system.
And then, of course, the ITQs immediately take on a value which can be bought and sold on the market, correct?
As I understand, licenses held by individual fishermen are also bought and sold. The privilege is exchanged on the market. That there are quota systems that are transferable, and where they are transferable, it is specifically to introduce the kind of flexibility in the system that would allow fishermen to be able to transfer that quota.
Yes. You would agree that for a fisherman to have to buy quota, that fisherman would be incurring a cost which he does not otherwise have to incur.
A fisherman could buy quota, which would incur a cost. A fisherman can also acquire a license, which does incur cost.
I'm wondering if anyone in your department has done any study of the effect of quotas in other sectors, such as the dairy industry, and in particular the indication that those quotas have created a windfall for the first generation and a terrible burden for subsequent generations wishing to enter that industry. Have those sort of studies been done?
The kind of studies that, to my knowledge, have been done, that either have been done by the department or considered by the department, are those that apply to common property resources. And quota systems or share-based systems or transferable quota systems that pertain to common property resources.
Turning to the PIC fee license scheme, are you aware that the department holds about 14 Area G troll licenses at present acquired through PIC fee funding, and has so far refused to reissue them to West Coast Vancouver Island First Nations?
I'm aware there are some Area G troll licenses in the holdings of PIC fee. I am not aware that we have refused to issue those to West Coast First Nations.
I think it was Mr. Shamoot who said that the intention is that those would be used for transfer of access upriver to First Nations upriver. That's the general. Isn't that why they're being held in inventory?
They are being used both in marine fisheries and used in planning through PIC fee for both marine fisheries and potentially for in-river fisheries. They're used for both.
Yes, all right.
And in fact, there are negotiations I have been a part of where salmon licenses, including troll licenses, were very much part of the discussion.
We had evidence on August 19th that about 15% of the PIC fee resources of about 100 million over 5 years was earmarked for moving access to salmon fishery in-river to in-river First Nations for terminal fisheries. I want to know whether there's been any change in this policy with respect to West Coast Vancouver Island First Nations following the recent decision of the Court of Appeal in the Ahousaht case.
I should say that is not a policy. That the 15% identified of PIC fee funds and salmon licenses was a practice, and that they have not all, nor where they intended all to go to upriver. Many of them have been used to support the in-river fisheries, but not all of them. And there's certainly negotiations with many of the PIC fee First Nations groups who have asked for and received interim use of salmon licenses and who have negotiated the use of marine salmon licenses in their ongoing proposals. So both marine fishing licenses, that is regular commercial fishing licenses, and the pilots upriver have been supported by the PIC fee licenses that have been retired.
Do you agree that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal fishermen alike operating in the integrated coastal fishery have the advantage of what's been called a diverse portfolio of other species to access on salmon off-cycle years, and yet still face significant challenges in terms of long-term economic viability? Do you accept that as a general statement?
There are more species and therefore more licenses, and therefore an ability to adapt to changing markets and economic conditions for licenses in the marine environment generally than there are in freshwater.
Yes. That fishery, the coastal commercial fishery, still faces significant challenges, does it not? even with that advantage?
Depending on the species, the kind of fishery, where it takes place, and the market value of the particular fish in a year, yes, the fishing industry is a challenging business.
Would you agree with me that those, those challenges increase as the total allowable catch available to the coastal salmon industry decreases?
I think the management structure of the fishery, which provides for access, which has reduced access to mixed stock fisheries, has meant that without further change, the amount of available fish for harvest has reduced access to the commercial fishery. However, at the same time, I note that in demonstration fisheries, where salmon fishermen have chosen to test share-based fisheries, that they report an increased value that is more money for less fish. So I think there are two sides to that coin.
And it differs for each individual fishery too, does it not?
It does. It's very dependent on the gear, whether the gear is selective, where it takes place,
Yes.
and, for example, a fishery on a stock that is not a multi-stock or a mixed stock fishery is certainly far easier to deal with in terms of management and access for the fishermen.
Ms. Dansrow, could I ask you, well, first of all, you're aware, obviously, of the large expenditure of public funds that has been made over the past decade or so on the revitalization strategy to reduce fleet size with the object of ensuring that the remaining fleet is economically sustainable?
To some extent, yes.
Yes. Is it still a policy objective of the Government of Canada under the Fisheries Act and Oceans Act to have sustainable and economically viable ocean fisheries and to benefit coastal communities so far as possible?
So far as possible, yes, although we've changed the language to economically prosperous.
Should that policy objective be taken into account in the socioeconomic analysis that DFO managers are required to carry out under the wild salmon policy?
Yes, although, as you know, conservation has to be our first principle, and so once that's taken into consideration and we're not threatening species, then the allocation and the management decisions come into play against socioeconomic realities.
You need a scientific biological basis of information to assess those risks and also some basis for assessing the socioeconomic considerations.
Yes.
Yes, all right. I'd like to turn to the wild salmon policy, if I may, Exhibit 8 at page 14. Page 14, paragraph beginning, DFO has responsibility. It's right under there. DFO has, and I'll just read it because it's useful to read this again. DFO has responsibility to provide sustainable harvesting opportunities that will best meet its obligations to First Nations, contribute to the social well-being, and provide employment and other economic benefits to individuals and fisheries-dependent communities. A significant challenge for this policy is to safeguard the genetic diversity of salmon while accounting for and realizing these benefits of the salmon catch, since harvest restrictions necessarily conserve the wild salmon resource, affect communities and individuals. Cultural, social, and economic impacts need to be considered. Some critics will suggest that consideration of the social and economic benefits arising from salmon harvesting will compromise salmon conservation. Others will claim that a focus on maintaining diversity means the elimination of major salmon fisheries. In reality, the interests of both salmon and people need to be accounted for. Could we go up to the upper right? Need to be accounted for in a successful conservation program. This policy reflects a management framework that can provide care and respect for a resource and its ecosystem and for the people within it. Protecting the resource space provides the maximum potential for benefits to people. The full measure of wild salmon policy's success will be the achievement of salmon conservation accompanied by human well-being. So, Ms. Farthinger, I interpret that as meaning that the WSP requires a kind of merging of socioeconomic well-being with conservation. Am I right?
I think generally that's true, and it's certainly expressed in the wild salmon policy, and particularly focused in Strategy 4.
Yeah. Another way of saying it in its application and intent is that it contemplates the continuance of a mixed stock fishery, the fisheries that presently support many individuals, families, and fisheries dependent communities in a manner that also conserves and protects the resource base. Is that
Could you maybe say that again? I'm sorry.
So I'm trying to kind of summarize or encapsulate the idea. It contemplates the continuance of the mixed stock fisheries that presently support many individuals, families, and fisheries dependent communities in a manner that also conserves and protects the resource base.
I'm not sure I agree with the summary of continuing at all costs a mixed stock fishery. I think that economic values are something that can be considered, and social values, in a fairly limited context by fisheries and oceans. And by that I say that fisheries and oceans on the Pacific coast does not say that if you're a fisherman who lives in Ucluelet or in Bella Bella that you cannot move to Vancouver or Delta or Vancouver Island. And in fact, many fishermen, successful fishermen have. DFO cannot say you can build a processing facility in X, Y, or Z location. That's simply not within the scope of our regulatory responsibility. So while we can put choices in front of people that provide for conservation, I would not agree with you that these statements you've just read led us to believe that the mixed stock fishery is the only or the best way to fish for salmon in a profitable way.
I didn't mean to make that implication, and I didn't mean to read in the words at all costs if I did. Mr. Lunn, could I have document number 2 on the screen, please? Social well-being approach, and I'd like to read a passage from page 4. The most obvious and commonly advocated, this is, I should say, an international article. It deals with international matters that we also see here. Most obvious and commonly advocated global policy response to the fisheries crisis is to reduce fishing effort by cutting the number of fishers and boats in operation, following the Malthusian argument that there are too many fishers chasing too few fish. Accordingly, fisheries policy regimes around the world consistently adopt a set of policies whose main purpose is to reduce fishing effort and to remove fishers from those ecosystems perceived as under threat. The measures adopted involve the use of standard policy instruments such as licensing gear, restrictions, and catch quotas, but also the newer approaches such as individualized transferable quotas, which create individualized virtual property rights in an effort to enable market-type transactions in marine protected areas. And it talks about a number of failings and dropping down about 6 lines. This failing is most obvious. There it is. This failing is most obvious in criticisms of the distributional shortcomings of an ITQ-based management system, much touted by mainstream fisheries economists. And finally, a passage on page 5, the next page, upper left, the last 6 lines of the top paragraph, the displacement of fishers. The displacement of fishers from often ancestral occupations that are the basis for pride, a sense of personal and social identity, and of cultural heritage raises fundamental questions about the trade-offs between conservation, development, and the human right to a distinctive and culturally informed way of life. Ms. Farlinger, those seem to highlight the same issues you face in implementing the wild salmon policy. Would I be correct?
Well, it's certainly a set of very broad statements, ranging from marine protected areas to share-based fisheries and the reduction of the fleet. I think in our instance, the reduction of the salmon fleet was a very specific and focused activity in which the government made a significant investment. That was aimed at a viable fishery, as you point out. I do think that there are a number of ways to design management systems, whether they are share-based or whether they are not. And I think that the basic proposition, and this is my view, the basic proposition that shares create a sense of ownership is really a bit of a red herring, excuse me for saying that, because really it is the holding of the license in perpetuity, whether it is for a competitive fishery or for a share-based fishery. It's really that which gets at the issue of some people having access or being able to purchase access either through the buying of a license or of a share, that really is the long-term access question to the fishery. So I certainly don't agree with some of the premises in here, but I think it's very broad, and I could probably agree with parts of it and not parts of others.
All right. I wonder if we could just have that mark, please, as the next exhibit.
1951.
Now, Mr. Bevan, I'd like to ask you some questions, and I thank you for the explanation you gave of the precautionary approach. And I think I've got it right, haven't I, that it originates as a matter of Canadian law and policy from the United Nations Fisheries Agreement of '95, which was incorporated into Canadian policy in 2003.
Yes, that is the mechanism that was that created the obligation to move into the precautionary approach.
Yes. I'd like to add that United Nations agreement that's been discussed to the record. If Mr. Lund could pull it up, please. I've discussed this with Mr. Taylor. It wasn't in the disc. Mr. Lund, could you pull up the United Nations Fisheries Agreement? United Nations Conference on Straddling Fish Stocks and Highly Migratory Stocks, Agreement for the Implementation of the Provisions, etc. This, I think, is the UNFA, is it not?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes. Could that be marked, please?
1952.
And Mr. Bevan, you explained, thank you, that this was developed in the context of a multi-year class fish populations, and that your challenge was to apply it to a different type of stock. We have here, namely, a stock of salmon where you have 1 year class that all die after spawning.
Yes, that's correct. This was designed to deal with the normal marine fish populations, and doesn't necessarily fit as well in its design concept to an anadromous fish stock where the entire spawning stock dies off.
Yes. The last page, Mr. Lund, is Annex 2, and it seems to be the guidelines for application of the precautionary reference points. Yes, if we could highlight that in the in particular second paragraph. The second paragraph deals with the concept of limit reference points, and the second sentence reads, limit reference points set boundaries which are intended to constrain harvesting within safe biological limits within which the stocks can produce maximum sustainable yield. So that's the basic originating concept. Is that
Yes, the concept was that there would be decision rules set around reference points. The limit reference point is the reference point that defines the transition of the stock from a cautious zone and into a critical area where there's a danger of serious or irreparable harm, and you don't want to go there, and therefore your decision rules should limit fishing mortality in that regard. And then there's reference points for defining the end of the cautious zone and entry into a situation where you can move towards a higher yield. I think the concept of maximum sustainable yield has been reevaluated since this document was put together, because it assumes a steady state, and that you can define something over a multi-year term that is not taking into consideration significant variations in the ecosystem. In addition, we'll just leave it at that point.
Yes, we've got limited time here. Am I right that some 77 nations have to date signed this international agreement, including the U.S.?
I'd have to confess that I haven't got a current count. All I know is that it is enforced now because it's been ratified by enough nations that that's the case.
Are you aware that the U.S. has signed on to it?
I have to confess that the U.S. hadn't signed on to the UN Law of the Sea Convention, so I'm not quite sure of their status regarding this, and
No.
I haven't had a briefing on that.
All right. Well, I suggest they have, and that this model is also the origin of the Alaskan approach, but I won't pursue that with you. If we just go, before we leave it, to paragraph 7, that down at the bottom of the page, Mr. Lunn, and read the second sentence. This relates to the upper limit reference point. It says, for stocks which are not overfished, fishery management strategies shall ensure that fishing mortality does not exceed that which corresponds to maximum sustainable yield, and that the biomass does not fall below a predefined threshold. So that deals with the upper benchmark, and it seems that if you have a healthy stock, you can crop it back to the MSY level. That's the basic concept, is it not?
The concept is that at the healthy stock will allow for a bigger harvest, obviously, and that your harvest level should be such that you don't endanger the productivity of that stock and move it on a trajectory towards a cautious zone. I would, however, point out that, again, that there's an issue here in that not all populations are responsive to controlling fishing mortality in the same way. So some stocks are multi-year, low natural mortality, and they may be more influenced by fishing mortality than short-lived variable productivity stocks where the ecosystem may have a much greater influence than the fishing mortality.
All right. Now, Mr. Leadham referred to you to Exhibit 1940, if we could bring that up, which I think deals with the Canadian acceptance of this model. This discusses the model being accepted into Canada. Is that correct, Mr. Bevan?
That's correct.
And page 4, if we could have it, explains removal reference again. The paragraph is beginning the removal reference. The removal reference is the maximum acceptable removal rate. Removal rate is the ratio of all human-induced removals and total exploitable stock size. So just so we understand that, if we have a stock size of 20 million and the MSY level is 2 million, which you may have in a very healthy salmon run, before we take into account the balancing with other stocks, this model provides for would provide for a removal of 18 million, 18 out of the 20 million.
I think that's an oversimplification. Again, this is taking what is designed for a multi-year spawning stock standing biomass and trying to then interpret it against the different biology of the salmon. So that's why there's a wild salmon policy that takes the concept and modifies it to fit the biology of Pacific salmon. What this says is that you must have a limit on your removals, and if you saw the removal rate on the graph, it was flatlined in the healthy zone, so that you would make sure you didn't move the stock back into the cautious zone. But that applies to a multi-year standing spawning stock biomass, and does not apply to how it has to be interpreted relevant to Pacific salmon.
All right. But there's nothing in the UN model or this Canadian scientific paper adopting it which would limit removals to a 60% rate. The removal is intended to be a proportion of exploitable stock size and the MSY point. Is it not?
Again, I think that the application of MSY in the context of the biology of the Pacific salmon is a bit of a stretch. What we need to do in the Pacific salmon context is understand the the spawning escapement targets and the river conditions and migration conditions, and then work backwards from that to determine your harvest rates. To do a formula on a stock based on something designed for another reality would be very risky.
All right. Well, I think we've dealt with the concept. I want to ask you, with regard to the precautionary approach, whether you deal with this. This comes from another exhibit, but I'm just going to read you one sentence, and I think you will agree with it. This is with respect to the application of the precautionary approach. The appropriate risk to consider when using this framework is the probability of and the severity of the impact from management actions on stock productivity. That's the risk that you're dealing with when you're applying the precautionary approach, is it not?
Yes, that is the one of the risks, I should say, because part of the precautionary approach, as we now understand it after a number of years of use, is that we have to deal with the risks the fishing activity poses to the ecosystem and the impact of the ecosystem and its productivity will have on the population. So it's a bit broader than that now, but yes, that's the risk that we're primarily controlling.
Thank you. And would you agree that in a mixed stock fishery, you would include the impacts on stock productivity of both the healthy stock and the weak stock? Correct?
You have to consider in a mixed stock fishery the overall impacts of the fishing activity on the suite of co-migrating stocks, and you also have to look at the possibility of the impacts. Reversibility. In other words, if you overfish to a point of extirpation a weak stock, then you don't have any options in the future.
Yes, but the only point I want to make, because we've heard a lot about weak stocks, is that applying the precautionary principle would also include considering the risk of a healthy stock getting hammered down through delayed density-dependent effects.
You have to consider all of the aspects, and again, the basic principle in the precautionary approach is that your actions should not lead to irreversible impacts.
Or irreversible or long-term, would you not? Also,
both.
Yes, all right. Well, we're here in this commission dealing with a long-term decline, I think you would. And I want to ask Dr. Richards a few questions with respect to Exhibit 1364, if we could have that brought up. 1364, this has been dealt with. This is the draft summary report of the April 14th and 15th workshop. At page 7, the overescapement issues dealt with towards the bottom. And the last 3 bullet points, if we could highlight them. Third from the bottom bullet points, Chilco and Quesnel 2010 escapements, S-max 200 to 500% and will likely be hammered in coming years. Negative effects observed at S-max greater than 200% and apparent in current brood year plus at least 3 following years. PSC report on uncertain, likely to unlikely, move to likely for long-term decline. Is that an outline of the discussion that took place, or a summary of the discussion, Dr. Richards?
I think that is a summary of some of what was going on in that presentation. I was not actually at the workshop on that particular day. I was at the workshop on the following day, so I can't personally verify that that was what was said.
Okay.
But I understand that Dr. Selby would have had an opportunity to write this. That would have been his, likely would have been some of his wording.
Yes. The interesting thing about delayed density dependence or density dependence is that you don't need to know the biological mechanism for it, because decades of stock recruit data tell you that it happens after a certain spawner density. Is that fair?
I think that that is very much a generalization.
Yes.
And I think that there is some very good discussion of this in technical report number 10.
Yes.
In particular, the summary on page 45 of that technical report, where Dr. Peterman goes on to really say that delayed density dependence overall, there's no evidence that it's happening generally.
Yes.
There is some evidence for it, most likely in Quesnel.
He wrote that report before this workshop that you set up here, didn't he?
That's correct.
Yeah. Now.
And I also say that on that third last bullet, they're talking about what is there is really, I would say, speculation. We are continuing to do some work and looking at what's going on within some of those populations. And I believe that from the preliminary work that's been done right now, we're looking at, for Chilco Lake, which is what's referenced here, one of the highest productivities on record, so from the preliminary data. So I would say that that speculation there, based on work that has continued over the summer, is probably not correct.
I would, you mean to say it's changed from April to now?
Between April, first of all, I think the comment from Dr. Selby was really one of projection. So he is speculating there. That's a hypothesis. It's not based on evidence. And the evidence that we have collected to date would suggest that that speculation turns out to be false, at least for Chilco Lake.
Yeah. Well, you've got research evidence with respect to density effects, do you not? And I'll refer to one, and that's at my document number 8, Mr. Lund. This hasn't been marked yet, so I'd like to add it. This is entitled Preliminary Report on Sockeye Fry, Quesnel, Shuswap Lakes, 2003. Jeremy Hume, Ken Shortreed, and Steve McLennan. That's a research document developed by your department, is that right?
Of that document, since I didn't see any of the surrounding material and it wasn't really identified, but I do know that they were doing studies, and they were doing studies at that time. And it would have been some of the information from that work which would have been referenced by Dr. Selby and also by Dr. Peterman.
Yeah. All right, could that be marked, please?
1953.
My time is up, but Mr. Lowe's has kindly given me 10 minutes, and I know that's a kindness on his part because he's limited in time too. Let me just ask you this general concept. The biological mechanism for these density effects, it could be starvation, could be pathogens, or a combination of both. Is that correct, Dr. Richards?
I think we need to be clear to which you're specifically referring. Are you specifically referring to delay density dependence? Or you're talking about, there's multiple factors at play here.
Well, let's take first the Ricker model standard of density dependence, which is seems everybody accepts. Could be caused due to starvation. The limit on the carrying capacity could be caused by starvation or pathogens, correct?
That's a very limited subset. I think that it could be due to a wide range of potential factors. It could be lack of spawning habitat. It could be just poor growth rates, not necessarily starvation. That's sort of an extreme case. In some kinds of situations, it's often thought that there's some cannibalism which can help lead to this.
Right.
So it's a very, very general concept which could have a lot of factors which could be at play.
But you don't exclude pathogens as one of them. Pathogens resulting from the sockeye being so densely confined.
Well, I think that is one of a very wide range of possibilities, and I wouldn't necessarily put that at the top of my list.
I thought you agreed, didn't you, with Mr. McDade, that crowding amplifies the pathogens.
I think at that time we were talking about a quite different context, but just because something is possible in theory doesn't mean that is exactly the rationale for what's going on in that particular situation.
Are you aware that DFO and the aquaculture industry tried about 20 years ago to raise sockeye in fish farms, and that attempt failed because the sockeye could not withstand the crowding in fish farms?
I'm not aware specifically of what you're discussing. I do know that we do have trouble in general with sockeye in a laboratory situation, so that might be similar.
Yes. They carry certain diseases like IHN throughout their whole life cycle, don't they?
Well, again, you've made a very general statement, and it's not. I mean, you're assuming then that all fish are sick, and I think that that's not the case. In fact, what I didn't have a chance to mention earlier was that we have been undertaking some studies of smolts now within the Strait of Georgia, and have been looking at screening them for pathogens, and we have not been finding any evidence of any viruses in the fish that we've looked at to date.
But you've nevertheless put down pathogens as one of the likely causes for the decline in this summary workshop report, correct?
I think we were, but this was not in the context of delayed density dependence.
Well, delayed
or density dependence.
Well, whatever context.
But it was in a different context that we were thinking of it. It wasn't in that context.
But you have no way of tracing the origin of the inflated or increased pathogen level, do you, in the sockeye in the Gulf of Georgia or Queen Charlotte Sound?
First of all, you've made an assumption that there's an increased pathogen level, and I'm not sure that that's consistent. I mean, we have seen different levels of diseases at different times, but it's not been something where we've got a consistent trend.
I'd like to turn to the to exhibit 1908 for a moment. At page 0014. The Shuswap graph in the middle indicates the 2010 run. This is only the females, effective females, at over 3.5 million. The carrying capacity with the red asterisk, somewhat less than 1 million, indicating that there's over 5 million fish that were not removed from that particular CU that could have been removed. And I want to ask Ms. Farlinger this, that before the late summer run fishery was closed in 2010, leading to the situation, there was a seine opening at the mouth of the Fraser, correct?
There were a number of seine fisheries, but
Yes.
there was a seine fishery at the mouth of
Yes.
the Fraser. Right?
And there was such an abundance of sockeye that they were catching huge catches. One is up to 35,000 sockeye in one set, I'm told.
There were big seine catches in the
Yes.
fishery.
And one advantage of the seine fleet is it provides a tap for fishery managers, does it not, that you can turn off to regulate escapement levels. Correct.
I'm not sure I understand your reference.
Well, all right. Well, at any rate, the fishery was closed primarily to protect weak stocks. Is that correct? Primarily.
Ultimately, the limiting factor on the fishery at the end of the fishery on the laid stocks had to do with protecting weak stocks. Yes.
Primarily Thompson coho.
It would depend on the date of the fishery. It could be Thompson coho. It could a little later be steelhead. It could earlier be Cultus sockeye.
If we look at 5 million sockeye in the Shuswap alone, and we give them a $20 value each, that's $100 million. Ms. Farlinger, supposing you were asked whether to close the fishery or not in circumstances like that, do you think you'd want to do a quick calculation of the amount of the loss to the GDP of Canada resulting from foregone harvest of sockeye?
I think that that's certainly one of the factors that needs to be considered and is considered by fishery managers, and one of the reasons we need a policy like the wild salmon policy to guide us when we have extraordinary runs as we did in 2010.
Who made the decision to close the fishery?
The decision to close the fishery would have been made on the grounds by the fishery manager.
Did they do a calculation, do you know, of the amount of the foregone harvest or the number of Thompson coho that they were attempting to save, or the possibility of lost production through density effects?
I know there was discussion at the time in which I participated about the value of the fish that had been landed already in the commercial fishery, the value of fish that may additionally be landed in that fishery as part of the management decision.
Supposing you were engaged in the sockeye fishery as a seine boat operator and struggled for years to keep his business viable, you would have expected those calculations to be made before the sockeye fishery was closed, would you not?
Not being a seine operator, I couldn't say, but I suppose a seine operator might expect that.
And you would expect, given the huge importance of the decision, you'd expect a retrospective analysis afterwards to see if it was properly done, and you'd expect transparency, would you not? So that stakeholders could see whether the decision was the right one.
I think that the post-season review is, in fact, exactly that. Yep.
Has an analysis been done to show basically the cost of each coho that was saved?
I don't believe an analysis has been done on the cost of the coho.
Or the cost to GDP of the foregone harvest in the Shuswap and the other strong runs?
I think that there has been an economic analysis that I'm just going to make brief reference to, and it had to do with whether the Cultus River stock should or should not be listed under the Species at Risk Act. And there was an economic analysis done there, and it was the commitment of the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans to manage for that weak stock that provided the rationale for the support of the government to not list the Cultus sockeye. So While this specific economic analysis that you refer to in 2010, to my knowledge, has not been done with respect to coho and the value of coho, I think the broader economic analysis on whether a species would be listed under the Species at Risk Act, which really was the one of the formative steps in terms of implementing weak stock management, has been done.